Welcome back to the Make Heaven Crowded podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into Genesis chapter 3,
Oh, yeah.
a chapter so packed with meaning.
Yeah.
It's shaped Western thought for millennia.
Mm.
We're going to break it down verse by verse,
Okay.
really unpack what's going on and why it matters even today.
It's a chapter that raises so many profound questions.
Hmm.
Where did evil come from?
Yeah.
Why is there suffering in the world?
Mhm.
What does it mean to be human? Genesis 3 grapples with all of these.
Right from the start, in verse 1, we're introduced to the serpent. But it becomes clear pretty quickly that this isn't your average garden snake.
Exactly. Genesis subtly hints at this. But later in the Bible, both Revelation 12.9 and 20.2 outright identify this serpent as Satan. We see the serpent as a vessel for his deception.
Okay, so talking animals, that's where some people might check out and say, all right, this is clearly a myth.
I get that, but the Bible actually provides a framework for understanding this.
Yeah.
And it's the idea of demonic influence, a spiritual being working through a physical form. It's not that the snake suddenly learned to speak perfect Hebrew.
So kind of like in Numbers 22 with Balaam's donkey, right?
That's a great parallel. And that story helps us see that these talking animal instances aren't about literal vocal cords, but about God, or in this case, Satan communicating through unconventional means.
All right, so in verse 2, we see Eve responding to the serpent, and she misquotes God's command from Genesis 2.1617. God said, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but Eve adds, neither shall you touch it. Why is that small addition so significant?
Because it represents the very first example of what theologians call legalism. It's the idea that by adding extra rules and restrictions, we can somehow become more righteous or please God. But what we often see is that legalism doesn't actually lead to greater obedience. Instead, it can create misunderstanding, and ultimately, as we see with Eve,
Yeah.
it can be a doorway to rebellion.
And that rebellion becomes crystal clear in verses 4 and 5. Here, the serpent just straight up contradicts God, saying, ye shall not surely die.
Right.
He's essentially calling God a liar.
It's not just any lie, though. This one is packed with three potent deceptions.
Okay.
The denial of God's judgment, a distortion of God's character, and the insidious temptation of self-exaltation, that desire to become like God, to determine our own morality.
And that idea that we can become like gods, isn't that eerily similar to some modern philosophies?
It absolutely is. The serpent's lie echoes through the centuries. You can hear it in the claims of secular humanism, the idea that we are the ultimate arbiters of truth and morality. But Genesis 3 from the very beginning warns us of the devastating consequences of that kind of thinking.
And we see Eve fully give in to that temptation in verse 6. She sees the fruit is good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise.
Those three descriptions aren't accidental. They represent three fundamental categories of temptation that the Apostle John later describes in 1 John 2.16.
Okay.
The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life.
Isn't it interesting that those are the exact same temptations Jesus faced in the wilderness, as we see in Matthew 4?
It's more than just interesting. It's foundational to understanding God's plan of redemption. Jesus, as the second Adam, faces the same temptations that brought humanity down, but he overcomes them. This is where we see the hope that's woven into this story of the fall.
But for now, we're still in the midst of that fall. And in verse 7, we see the immediate consequence, shame. Adam and Eve suddenly realize they're naked, and they try to cover themselves with fig leaves. What's going on there?
It's about more than just physical nakedness. Their fig leaf coverings are a powerful symbol of their attempt to hide their guilt and shame from God. They've tasted the knowledge of good and evil, and now they're experiencing the weight of their disobedience.
But it makes what happens later in Genesis 3.21 even more significant.
Yeah.
God provides Adam and Eve with coats of skin, not just fig leaves.
Exactly. That act of providing those coats points to a crucial concept that runs throughout the Bible. Atonement requires bloodshed. The fig leaves represent humanity's feeble attempt at self-righteousness. We try to cover our own sin. But the coats of skin foreshadow the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus, whose blood covers our sin. Hebrews 9.22 spells this out. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins.
So we've got sin entering the picture, shame, the need for atonement. And then in verses 8 through 13, we witness this tense confrontation with God. It starts with God walking in the garden. Now, some scholars believe this could be a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus.
There's definitely a case to be made for that. Both John 1.18 and Colossians 1.15 refer to Jesus as the image of the invisible God. suggesting that he has always existed in intimate relationship with the Father. This walking in the garden could be a glimpse of that pre-incarnate presence.
And it adds a whole other layer of meaning to God's question in verse 9, where art thou?
Yeah.
It's clearly not about physical location.
Absolutely. It's about conviction. It's God drawing them out, inviting them to confess. And it's a question that still echoes down to us today. Where are you spiritually?
Yeah.
Where are you hiding from God?
What follows in verses 10 through 13 is just classic blame shifting. Adam blames Eve and God, saying, "The woman you gave me." Eve, of course, blames the serpent. No one wants to own up to what they've done.
It's a pattern we see repeated throughout human history, isn't it? It's so much easier to point fingers than to take responsibility for our own actions. But that blame shifting only perpetuates the problem. It doesn't lead to genuine repentance or reconciliation.
All right, so things aren't looking so good for humanity at this point. Sin has entered the world. We're hiding from God, blaming everyone but ourselves. And then in verses 14 through 19, we come to the pronouncement of the curses.
This is where things get even more intense. But it's also where we start to see the first glimmer of hope. Verse 15 in particular is arguably the most important verse in the entire chapter. It's often called the Protoevangelium, which means first gospel.
It's the first prophecy of Jesus Christ. God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." It's packed with symbolic language that can be tough to decipher.
Let's break it down.
Okay.
Her seed is a reference to Jesus Christ. Galatians 4:4 makes that clear when it says, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his son, made of a woman." So we see that Jesus, born of a virgin, fulfills this prophecy.
And then we have the imagery of bruising. "It shall bruise thy head." Speaks of Christ's ultimate victory over Satan.
Right. And "thou shalt bruise his heel" foreshadows Satan's temporary victory through the crucifixion. It's a picture of a battle, a cosmic conflict between good and evil, with Christ ultimately emerging as the victor.
It's an incredible foreshadowing of the crucifixion and resurrection. Satan would bruise Jesus on the cross, inflicting pain and suffering. But Jesus would ultimately crush Satan through his resurrection, as we see in Revelation 20:10.
And that victory, won by Christ on the cross, is what offers us hope. Genesis 3:15 is the foundation of the entire gospel message. It's the promise of a Redeemer who will conquer sin and death. It's the light shining in the darkness of the fall.
So even in the midst of these curses being pronounced, we have this incredible promise of redemption. Then in verse 16, we see the curse on Eve, which is primarily focused on increased pain in childbirth and the introduction of striggle in the marriage relationship.
And while those might seem like physical consequences limited to women, they speak to a broader reality of the brokenness that sin brings into all of our relationships.
Then verses 17 through 19 lay out the curse on Adam. Work becomes toilsome, the ground is cursed, and physical death enters the world.
That last part is so crucial for understanding the human condition. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Atheists often point to death and suffering as evidence against a loving God. But the Bible offers a different perspective. Death wasn't part of the original creation.
It was a direct consequence of sin, as Romans 5:1 explains. And ultimately, it's a consequence that Jesus conquers through his death and resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:54 to 5:4-7 proclaims, "Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?"
So while we still experience death in this life, the sting of death, its power to eternally separate us from God, has been removed because of Christ's sacrifice. And that brings us to the final section of the chapter, verses 20 through 24, where we see Adam and Eve expelled from the Garden of Eden. But before they leave, in verse 21, we witness another act of God's grace. He provides clothing for Adam and Eve, and not just any clothing, but coats made of animal skin.
Hold on, so we just talked about how God provided them with coats of skin earlier in the chapter. Is this a different set of clothing?
It's a great question, and it's led to some interesting debate among scholars. Some believe it's the same event, while others see this as a distinct act, emphasizing the ongoing nature of God's provision, even in the face of judgment.
Okay, so either way, the coats of skin, especially if it's the second instance, are more than just practical garments. They're laden with symbolism, right?
Exactly as we discussed earlier, they point to the concept of atonement, that covering of their nakedness, their shame, through the sacrifice of an animal, foreshadows the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus, whose blood covers our sin.
So even in the midst of pronouncing these curses, God is already hinting at a way back to him. It's this beautiful blend of justice and mercy that's so characteristic of God.
It's this tension that makes the biblical narrative so compelling. It's not a simplistic story of good versus evil, but a nuanced tapestry of human brokenness, divine grace, and the long arc of redemption.
And that redemption arc really starts to take shape in those final verses where Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. It might seem harsh at first glance, but is there a deeper meaning behind this expulsion?
Remember that in the garden, they still had access to the tree of life. God, in his mercy, removes them from the garden to prevent them from living eternally in a state of separation from him. Imagine the agony of living forever burdened by sin and guilt.
That's a powerful perspective. So the expulsion, while it signifies a loss of innocence in paradise, is also an act of protection. God is preserving the possibility of future reconciliation by preventing them from being permanently trapped in their fallen state.
Precisely. And that concept, that act of God intervening to protect us from ourselves, is a recurring theme throughout the Bible. He loves us too much to leave us to our own devices, even when those devices are leading us away from him.
So we end Genesis 3 not with a happy ending, but not a hopeless one either. It's the beginning of a much bigger story, the story of redemption. It's like this chapter sets the stage for the rest of the Bible.
That's a great way to put it. It's like the opening act of a cosmic drama. We've been introduced to the main players. The conflict has been established, and now we're left with this sense of anticipation. How will the story unfold? How will God, in his love and wisdom, reconcile humanity back to himself?
And the answer, as we've seen hinted at throughout this chapter, is through Jesus Christ. He is the seed of the woman who will crush the serpent's head, the one who will ultimately reverse the curse and offer us a way back to Eden, back to God's presence.
That's the beauty of Genesis 3. It doesn't just leave us with a diagnosis of our brokenness. It points us toward the cure.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from talking snakes to the origins of sin to the promise of a redeemer. Before we move on, let's just pause for a moment and recap the key takeaways from Genesis 3.
It all begins with the temptation and fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden. Satan, in the form of a serpent, subtly deceives Eve, who then entices Adam to eat from the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This act of disobedience brings sin into the world, fracturing our relationship with God and introducing shame, blame shifting, and ultimately the pronouncement of curses upon humanity and all of creation.
We see pain enter the world, work becomes toilsome, and physical death becomes a reality. But even in the midst of judgment, God provides clothing for Adam and Eve, foreshadowing the atonement to come through Jesus Christ. And most importantly, we see that first glimmer of the gospel message in Genesis 3.15, the promise of a redeemer who will crush the serpent's head.
This chapter, while ancient, is not just a historical account. It's a theological and philosophical cornerstone that explains the human condition, the ongoing battle between good and evil, and ultimately the hope of redemption that is offered through Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it really is. And it's not a hopeless ending, right?
No, not at all.
We see that there's this promise of redemption that's woven throughout this whole chapter.
Yeah, you see it right from the beginning. And it's interesting because those themes, temptation, sin, judgment, mercy, redemption, those are themes that we still grapple with today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing how this ancient text still speaks to us, thousands of years later.
Right, like it's not just a story, it's a mirror reflecting back our own human experience.
And I think that's what makes it so powerful, is that we can see ourselves in the choices that Adam and Eve made, right?
Exactly, like that tendency to blame shift.
Yeah.
Or to try to, rationalize our sin or...
Yeah, try to hide it.
Right.
To cover it up with those fig leaves.
Yeah, those fig leaves of our own making. And just like God provided those coats of skin, pointing towards a deeper atonement, He provides for us through Christ. And that's what makes the gospel message so powerful.
So it's that grace.
Yeah.
It's not about us earning our way back. It's about receiving that free gift.
That's good. Earlier we talked about the concept of the last Adam.
Oh, yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. So in 1 Corinthians 15.45, Paul writes, "The first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit." So essentially, Adam, through his disobedience, brought sin and death into the world.
Right.
But Jesus, as the last Adam, through his obedience, brings life and righteousness.
So it's like he's undoing the damage that Adam caused.
Exactly. He's reversing the curse. He's offering us a new beginning.
Yeah, I love that imagery of undoing the damage. Because it really is like we were set on this trajectory of sin and death and separation from God.
Right.
And Jesus comes in and he's like, nope, I'm turning the ship around.
He's redirecting us,
Yeah.
back towards life and back towards God.
So Genesis 3, it could easily leave us feeling condemned, but instead it leaves us with this incredible sense of hope.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the gospel message. It's that even in the midst of judgment, God's mercy shines through.
It really is. It's like,
A paradox.
it is a paradox.
Right, we deserve judgment, but we're offered forgiveness.
Right, it's like if you were in a courtroom and the judge pronounced you guilty, but then stepped down from the bench, took your place, and paid your fine.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Mm.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis 3, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away? I think the key takeaway is that Genesis 3 isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting the human condition. It shows us our capacity for both good and evil, our tendency towards rebellion and self-righteousness, but it also points us towards that hope of redemption that's found in Jesus Christ.
And that redemption isn't just some future event, right?
No, it's available right now.
It is.
It's a free gift. All we have to do is accept it.
It's like we're still clinging to those fig leaves when we try to earn our own salvation.
That's right. We're trying to cover up our own mess
Yeah.
when we need to let Christ's sacrifice clothe us.
Wow, this has been an incredible journey through Genesis 3.
It really has.
It's a chapter that's both challenging and comforting, but ultimately it leads us to the cross, to the heart of the gospel message.
Absolutely. It's the foundation of the entire biblical narrative.
So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been insightful and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit life-changing.
Yeah, as you go about your week, we encourage you to reflect on those truths that we discussed. Where do you see echoes of Genesis 3 in your own life? Where are you tempted to hide from God? Or to blame shift? Or to cling to your own fig leaves of self-righteousness? And most importantly, how can you more fully embrace the grace and redemption that's offered through Jesus Christ?
Those are great questions. Thanks for joining us on the Make Heaven Crowded podcast.